What if the voices you hear in the dark weren't in your head, but under your floor? The first night in the farmhouse, Claire Jacobs woke to the sound of whispering. At first, she thought it was her husband, Daniel, murmuring in his sleep beside her. But when she rolled over, she saw his chest rising and falling steadily, his mouth slack in the easy rhythm of dreamless rest. The whispering didn't stop. It was faint, so faint she almost convinced herself it was the wind seeping through the old wooden shutters. Still, it had a rhythm, a cadence, like words carried across a great distance. She held her breath and listened harder. That was when her stomach tightened. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were coming from beneath the floorboards. Claire froze, straining her ears. For a moment she was sure she heard her name, soft, deliberate, as if spoken by someone crouched directly under the bed. She bolted upright, her pulse hammering in her throat. "Daniel," she whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What? Do you hear that?" He listened for a beat, the silence stretching. The whispering had stopped, leaving only the house's old bones creaking in the night air. Daniel gave her a groggy smile. "It's an old farmhouse, Claire. Pipes, wood, the wind. You've been on edge since we moved." She wanted to argue, but instead she nodded, lying back down. He was right. It had been a stressful month, packing, moving, adjusting to a house built in the 1800s that seemed to breathe with its own personality. Still, as she drifted back into a restless sleep, she couldn't shake the echo of her name, whispered from the darkness below. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, chasing away the unease. Claire busied herself with unpacking while Daniel went to check the barn. Their daughter, Lily, 6 years old and endlessly curious, ran barefoot through the house, squealing with excitement at every discovery. "Mommy," she called from the living room. "There's a secret door." Claire hurried over and found Lily kneeling by the far wall, her tiny fingers prying at a loose floorboard. Sure enough, beneath the rug and warped wood was a trapdoor, flush with the planks, sealed shut with a rusted iron latch. Claire forced a laugh. "It's probably just an old storage cellar." But as she reached down to tug Lily away, she felt a strange chill bleed through the floorboards, as if something cold and damp pressed up against them from below. She quickly covered it again, telling herself it was nothing. That night, the whispers returned. Louder this time. Clearer. Claire clutched the blankets to her chest as her heart thundered. Claire. Her name, again, drawn out, mournful. This time, Daniel heard it too. His eyes snapped open, and they both sat rigid in the dark, staring at the floor. The voices rose in a chorus of desperate murmurs, as if dozens of people were speaking at once, their words indistinguishable except for one repeated phrase that chilled Claire to her core. "Let us out." The sound seeped up through the floorboards, vibrating through the wood, until the entire room felt alive with it. Daniel leapt out of bed, fumbling for the flashlight. "It's got to be animals," he said, though his voice was shaking. "Maybe raccoons or..." But animals didn't beg. When the beam of the flashlight hit the floor, the voices cut off instantly, leaving a silence so sharp it felt like a blade pressed against their ears. And then, just as suddenly, a single voice spoke, low and clear, directly beneath their bed. "We know you can hear us." Claire screamed. Daniel didn't sleep the rest of that night. He sat in the corner chair, flashlight balanced across his lap, his eyes darting from the trapdoor in the living room to the bedroom floorboards as though at any second something, or someone, might come crawling through. Claire curled under the blankets, her body stiff, her hands trembling so badly she dug little crescent-shaped marks into the fabric. The whispers did not return, but the silence was worse. It wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was a waiting silence, heavy, deliberate, as though the voices knew the Jacobs family now believed. And belief, Claire realized, was exactly what the voices wanted. By morning, Daniel had adopted a forced practicality. Over coffee at the scarred oak kitchen table, he insisted there had to be a rational explanation. "These houses have crawl spaces. Air pockets. The wood shifts. You hear one thing, your mind fills in the rest. It's psychology, Claire. She wanted to believe him, but she could still hear that last voice in her head, etched into her skull. We know you can hear us. No warped timber could have spoken so directly. Daniel decided to confront it head-on. We'll check under the trapdoor today, he said firmly, as though speaking the words could anchor him in reality. If something's living down there, animals, squatters, whatever, we'll clear it out. If it's nothing, then we'll know it's just nerves. Deal? Claire hesitated. Every instinct screamed to leave it shut, to let the thing, whatever it was, remain buried. But Daniel's determination, mixed with her own need for certainty, eventually wore her down. After breakfast, they moved the rug aside and crouched by the trapdoor. Up close, it looked older than the rest of the floorboards, as if it had been installed decades before the rest of the house was remodeled. The iron latch was stiff with rust, pitted with age, and when Daniel tried to lift it, it groaned like an old hinge giving its last breath. The moment he touched it, a faint draft of air seeped through the cracks. It was cold, unnaturally so, carrying with it a smell Claire couldn't quite place, damp, metallic, and faintly sweet, like something spoiled but not fully rotted. She gagged, covering her nose. Probably just mold, Daniel muttered, though he said it too quickly. He fetched a crowbar from the barn and forced the latch. With a reluctant squeal, the trapdoor gave way, exposing a yawning darkness beneath. A gust of cold air rushed out, scattering dust across the living room and sending a ripple of gooseflesh up Claire's arms. Daniel clicked on the flashlight and aimed it downward. A narrow wooden ladder descended into the gloom, its rungs blackened with age. The beam illuminated dirt walls, damp and streaked, leading into what appeared to be a crude chamber carved directly beneath the house. A cellar, Daniel said, though the word sounded hollow. No, Claire whispered, shaking her head. Cellars have shelves, barrels, tools. That looks, Doug, like it was made to hide something. Before Daniel could answer, Lily's small voice piped up from the hallway. What's down there? They both jumped, whipping around to see their daughter rubbing her eyes, still in her pajamas. Daniel forced a calm smile, quickly positioning himself between her and the open hatch. Nothing for you, kiddo. Just an old crawlspace. Go get dressed, okay? But Lily wasn't looking at him. She was staring at the darkness, her expression strangely serene. And then, in a voice almost too soft to hear, she said, "They're calling me." Claire's blood went ice cold. She lunged forward, scooping Lily into her arms, pulling her away from the opening. "Don't say that, baby. Don't listen." But Lily wasn't frightened. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, eyes still locked on the trapdoor. "They said my name. They said they've been waiting for me." Claire nearly dropped her. Daniel slammed the hatch shut, his face pale and drawn, sweat beading on his forehead. He dragged the heavy rug back over it and stood there for a long moment, as if anchoring it with his weight. The rest of the day passed in uneasy silence. Daniel busied himself with chores outside, hammering loose boards on the barn, while Claire kept Lily close, refusing to let her wander out of sight. Every creak of the old house, every sigh of the wind through the shutters, set her nerves on edge. When night came, neither of them wanted to return to bed. Still, exhaustion pulled them under eventually. For a while, it was quiet. Peaceful, even. Then, sometime after midnight, the voices came again. Only this time, there was no mistaking the words. "Lily. Lily, come play with us." Claire bolted upright, her scream lodging in her throat. Beside her, the bed was empty. Lily was gone. Claire's scream ripped through the bedroom, but the sound felt swallowed by the house, muffled as though the walls themselves absorbed her terror. She leapt from the bed, her bare feet slapping the wooden floorboards, her heart hammering with a primal, animal fear. "Lily," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "Lily, where are you?" Daniel was already on his feet, fumbling for the flashlight they kept by the nightstand. He snapped it on and swept the beam across the room, under the bed, toward the hallway. Nothing. Just shadows stretching long and warped in the narrow corridor. They tore through the upstairs rooms, Lily's bedroom with its half-unpacked boxes and scattered dolls, the bathroom with its clawfoot tub that groaned when the pipes rattled, the tiny guest room that smelled of dust and mothballs. Each was empty. Too empty. As if the house had been waiting for this moment, prepared for their child to vanish. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps. She wouldn't go outside, would she? Not in the middle of the night? Daniel didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew exactly where she had gone. Together they stumbled down the narrow staircase, the flashlight beam jittering wildly across peeling wallpaper and worn wooden steps. The house groaned with every movement, its old frame echoing like a drumbeat. Claire clung to the banister, her knees weak with dread. When they reached the bottom, the sight made her stomach twist violently. The rug had been pulled back. The trapdoor stood open. The smell rolled up from below, damp earth, metallic tang, and something sweeter, something foul that stuck to the back of the throat. The flashlight beam revealed the ladder, its rungs worn and slick. Dirt clung to the edges of the opening, freshly disturbed, as if small hands had gripped them. Claire dropped to her knees, screaming into the black void. "Lily! Baby, answer me!" For a moment, silence. Then, faintly, horribly, came the sound of giggling. Lily's giggling. But it wasn't light-hearted or playful. It was distant, echoing strangely, layered with something else. Other voices, overlapping hers, imitating her, twisting her laughter into something hollow and wrong. Claire tried to lunge forward, but Daniel yanked her back. "Wait. Don't just go down there blind." His voice was harsh, tight, but his hands shook as he held her. "We don't know what's under there." "I don't care," she spat, wrenching free. "That's my daughter." Daniel swore under his breath, then grabbed the crowbar and wedged it through his belt like a weapon. He swung the flashlight toward the opening again. The beam didn't reach far, swallowed almost immediately by the heavy dark. It wasn't just absence of light, it was density, a kind of thickness that seemed to resist being pierced. Still, he planted his foot on the first rung of the ladder. It groaned under his weight. He glanced back at Claire, who stood trembling, her nails digging into her palms so hard her skin broke. "Stay right behind me," he said. She nodded, though every fiber of her body screamed against descending. The ladder creaked as they climbed down, the air growing colder with each rung. The smell intensified, filling their nostrils until Claire gagged. The flashlight caught the rough-hewn dirt walls, roots snaking through them like veins, moisture dripping down in rivulets. They reached the bottom, a narrow chamber perhaps 10 feet across, the floor uneven dirt packed down by age. Daniel swung the flashlight in a slow arc. For a second, it was just emptiness. Then, as the beam slid across the far wall, Claire gasped. Carvings. Hundreds of them. Scratched into the dirt and stone with desperate hands, names. Dozens upon dozens of names etched in jagged lines. Some fresh, sharp and recent. Others crumbling, half swallowed by the earth. Claire's stomach dropped when she saw one written larger than the others, pressed deep into the wall as if carved with obsession. Lily. Her legs gave out and she collapsed against Daniel, who barely caught her. And then the whispers began again. Not muffled this time, not faint. They surged from every direction, echoing off the chamber walls, rising in a chorus so loud Claire clamped her hands over her ears. The words tangled together, but one sentence stood out, chilling indistinct, spoken in 100 overlapping voices that weren't quite human. "She belongs with us now." The flashlight flickered violently, and in that stuttering light, they both saw it. Tiny footprints in the dirt, leading deeper into a narrow tunnel yawning open at the back of the chamber. Footprints too small to be Daniel's. Too recent to be old. Claire screamed her daughter's name, but only the voices answered, laughing, taunting, echoing from the dark tunnel ahead. Daniel's grip on the flashlight tightened until his knuckles turned white, the thin beam cutting a jagged path across the dirt floor. The tiny footprints stretched ahead of them, vanishing into the yawning tunnel like a trail of breadcrumbs leading to the belly of some waiting beast. Claire pressed her trembling hand against the wall to steady herself, her palms sinking slightly into the damp soil. The earth felt alive beneath her touch, pulsing faintly, as though the house and the land itself had a heartbeat. She snatched her hand back, eyes wide, but said nothing, too terrified that speaking the truth aloud might make it more real. The tunnel smelled worse than the chamber. The deeper they went, the thicker the air became, humid, heavy, cloying with the coppery tang of rust and something rancid, like rotting leaves left too long in stagnant water. Each breath scraped the back of their throats, and every step they took stirred the earth into soft clouds that glowed faintly in the flickering beam, as though tiny motes of ash floated around them. Daniel's jaw was tight, his every muscle rigid, but Claire saw the way his hand shook as he kept the crowbar ready at his side. The footprints seemed to taunt them. Sometimes they were close together, like Lily had been skipping. Other times they veered sharply into the walls, dragging through the dirt before reappearing straight ahead, as if she had been pulled or guided. Claire's chest constricted each time the pattern shifted, her mind racing with images of her little girl's pale hand clasped by something unseen, something coaxing her deeper into the dark. The whispers followed them. No longer muffled, no longer scattered, they were clear now, threading through the air with mocking precision. Some hissed her name, Claire. Claire. Others laughed in high-pitched tones that mimicked Lily's voice. One whispered a sentence so close to her ear she stumbled, nearly collapsing into the dirt wall. "She's happy here. She's not yours anymore." Daniel caught her by the arm, steadying her, though his face had gone pale. "Don't listen," he muttered, his voice low and ragged. "They want us scared. That's all this is, scare tactics." But even as he said it, Claire heard the tremor beneath his words, the desperate edge of someone clinging to denial like a drowning man clutching driftwood. The tunnel began to slope downward, and the earth grew wetter. Mud squelched beneath their shoes, sucking at their soles with each step. Roots hung low from the ceiling, their tips slick with moisture, some so thick they resembled twisted ropes. One brushed against Claire's hair and she recoiled, biting back a scream as she imagined it tightening, wrapping around her throat like a noose. Then, abruptly, the tunnel widened. The flashlight beam spilled into a cavernous space beneath the house, larger than either of them could have imagined existed. The ceiling arched high above, its surface rough and uneven, glistening with condensation that dripped rhythmically to the ground. Stalactite-like formations jutted down in jagged points, casting grotesque shadows. The walls weren't smooth dirt anymore but carved, chiseled by hands, or claws, into patterns that curled and twisted like sigils. Symbols upon symbols layered over one another, forming an incomprehensible tapestry of madness. Claire's stomach twisted violently when her eyes landed on the far side of the cavern. There, arranged in a grotesque semicircle, were shapes. At first she thought they were boulders or collapsed piles of earth, but as Daniel angled the beam, her knees nearly gave out. They weren't rocks. They were bones. Hundreds of them, piled in careful mounds, skulls with hollow eye sockets staring upward, ribs curved like cages, femurs jutting out in tangled heaps. Some were old, crumbling to dust. Others still gleamed faintly, too new, too raw. The mounds stretched around the cavern's edge like some macabre offering, a silent audience of the dead. Claire's scream lodged in her throat. She stumbled back, pressing against Daniel's arm, her body trembling so violently she thought her bones might crack. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Oh my God, Danny, what is this?" Before Daniel could answer, the flashlight beam caught movement. On the cavern floor, half hidden in the shadows, was Lily's small figure. She stood barefoot, her nightgown smeared with dirt, her blonde hair falling tangled over her face. Her tiny shoulders rose and fell in a slow, unnatural rhythm, like she was breathing in time with something else. "Lily!" Claire screamed, lurching forward, but Daniel grabbed her, holding her back. "Wait, look at her!" His voice cracked, urgent. Claire froze, her eyes fixed on her daughter. Lily slowly raised her head, and for the first time, they saw her face. Her eyes, they weren't her eyes anymore. They were black. Not just the irises, the entire eye, black pools that reflected no light, endless voids that seemed to swallow the beam of the flashlight. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, it wasn't Lily's voice. It was a chorus, hundreds of voices layered on top of one another, young and old, male and female, human and inhuman, rising together in perfect unison. You should not have come here. The flashlight flickered again, and the cavern around them seemed to shift. The walls pulsed faintly, the sigils glowing with a sickly luminescence. The piles of bones rattled, as though stirred by some invisible force. And beneath it all, from deep in the earth, came the sound of something vast moving, something waking, its rumble reverberating through their feet and into their bones. Claire screamed for her daughter, but the black-eyed thing that looked like Lily only tilted its head, smiling with a mouth that no longer belonged to her child. Daniel's hand shook so violently that the beam of the flashlight swayed like a drunken spotlight, casting grotesque shadows across the cavern walls. Claire clutched his arms so tightly her nails dug into his skin, but neither of them could look away from the figure that stood before them, their daughter, and yet not their daughter. Lily's frail little body looked so familiar, so heartbreakingly real, but her eyes, those pits of blackness, void of innocence, of humanity, seemed to drink the light from the room. The thing wearing her skin tilted its head as if amused, strands of hair falling across its pale face, and when it smiled, the cavern filled with the sickening sound of bones shifting and grinding, echoing from the mounds that surrounded them. Claire's voice broke through the silence, high and raw, ripped straight from the core of her being. Give her back. Give me my baby back. Her words bounced off the cavern walls, but the creature didn't flinch. Instead, it raised one small hand, extending its fingers toward her in a gesture that was both childlike and sinister. You gave her to us the moment you opened the floor, it said, and though its lips barely moved, the sound thundered from every direction at once. It was the same chorus of voices layered over each other, the sound of hundreds speaking through one fragile body. The air quivered with it, thick and oppressive, pressing against their eardrums until Daniel winced and clamped his free hand over his head. Daniel forced himself to speak, his voice harsh, laced with terror he could barely contain. What are you? What do you want with her? The creature's grin widened, impossibly stretching across its face. We are what remains. We are what lies beneath. We want what was promised, what has always been promised. The cavern trembled as though its words carried physical weight, dust drifting down from the ceiling, the carved sigils glowing brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the unseen heartbeat of the earth. Claire's legs buckled, and Daniel pulled her close, but he could feel her trembling violently against him, her breath hitching in ragged sobs. He forced his gaze back to the creature, fighting every instinct to look away. Promise by who? He demanded, voice cracking. For a moment, silence. Then, from the piles of bones surrounding them, came the sound of whispering. Not from the creature itself, but from the skulls, their hollow mouths spilling secrets into the cavern air. The whispers merged, growing louder, until they became words, the keepers, the builders, those before you. They fed us, and we kept the balance. Claire clapped her hands over her ears, shaking her head violently, screaming stop it, stop it, stop it. But the voices only grew louder, echoing inside her skull as though they weren't coming from the cavern at all but from within her own mind. Lily's body took a single step forward, and the movement was wrong, jerky, puppet-like, as though pulled by strings. Her bare feet didn't disturb the dirt, instead, the ground seemed to ripple beneath them, softening like the surface of a pond. She pointed directly at Claire. You called us, the voices hissed. When you touched the earth. When you dug too deep. You opened the door, and now the child is ours. Claire let out a broken wail, surging forward in desperation, but Daniel yanked her back, wrapping both arms around her waist as she kicked and struggled against him. Claire, no, he shouted, his voice raw. That thing isn't her, it's not Lily. But even as he said it, his chest ached, because part of him wanted to believe, needed to believe, that somewhere inside that black-eyed shell was their little girl, trapped and screaming for them. The cavern floor suddenly shuddered, and with a sickening groan, the piles of bones began to shift, collapsing inward, rolling toward the center of the space. Skulls tumbled, femurs snapped under invisible pressure, ribs interlocked like puzzle pieces until the piles fused together into something new, something massive. Claire screamed and clung to Daniel as the bones knitted into a crude, hulking figure, towering above them. It was no longer a collection of remains but a monstrous body cobbled together from death itself, hollow sockets burning faintly with light as if thousands of trapped souls glared from within. The child thing, Lily's puppet, extended its hand toward the colossal bone figure, and it moved in response, stepping forward with a sound like a landslide. Each step rattled the cavern, shaking loose dirt from the ceiling. Daniel's instincts screamed at him to run, but when he looked behind them, the tunnel had changed. It wasn't a tunnel anymore, it was gone. The entrance had sealed, replaced by solid dirt as though it had never existed. They were trapped. Claire collapsed to her knees, her sobs choking in her throat. "Please," she whispered, staring at the black-eyed child that used to be her daughter. "Please, take me instead. Just give her back. Please." The creature tilted its head again, the faintest flicker of something almost human rippling across its face, curiosity, maybe pity, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You do not bargain," the voices intoned. "You surrender. All of you." And as the towering bone figure raised one massive arm, the cavern roared with the sound of 1,000 voices screaming in unison, drowning out everything else. The cavern seemed to fold in on itself as the colossal figure of bones advanced, its massive limbs groaning and cracking with each step. The ground quaked beneath its weight, and Daniel tightened his grip on the flashlight though he knew the pitiful beam could do nothing to stop it. Claire crouched low against him, clutching his shirt in both fists, her sobs muffled against his chest. The creature wearing Lily's body stood unmoving at the monster's side, watching with those fathomless black eyes, its lips curled in a parody of a child's smile. Daniel's mind spun, his heart slamming against his ribs like a drum. There was no exit. The tunnel was gone. They were trapped in a sealed tomb with a beast stitched together from centuries of death. He searched wildly for any kind of weapon, any advantage, but there was nothing, only bones, sigils carved into the earth, and the sound of their own terror echoing back at them. The towering figure raised its arm, and for a moment Daniel braced himself for the crushing blow. But instead of striking, it thrust its arm downward, slamming its skeletal hand into the cavern floor. The earth split open beneath the impact, a jagged fissure tearing across the chamber, spilling out a gust of hot, fetid air. Claire gagged as the stench hit them, a rank combination of sulfur, rot, and something metallic that burned their nostrils. From the fissure came a noise. At first, Daniel thought it was more whispers, but this sound was deeper, guttural, ancient. It wasn't language so much as hunger-given voice, a rumbling growl that resonated in his chest cavity. The walls pulsed with it, and the sigils carved into them flared brighter, casting the cavern in a sickly glow. Claire looked up, her tear-streaked face pale as bone. It's feeding it," she gasped, pointing at the fissure. "That thing, it's not the end. It's just a servant. There's something beneath even this." The thought made Daniel's blood run cold. All this, the bones, the whispers, the puppet wearing his daughter's face, it wasn't the source. It was only a doorway. The creature turned its gaze on him, tilting Lily's small head with mechanical slowness. "She understands," it said in its chorus of voices. "There is something older here. Something waiting. We keep it, satisfied. But it grows restless. You woke it." The fissure widened with a sharp crack, and Daniel swore he saw something move below, a ripple in the darkness, vast and sinuous, like a serpent coiling in the bowels of the earth. The ground shook again, and dust poured from the ceiling in choking clouds. Daniel's survival instinct screamed louder than his fear. He pulled Claire to her feet, shouting above the cacophony. "We have to stop this, we have to close it, whatever the hell it is." His voice was hoarse, desperate, but he clung to the thought because it was the only thing that kept him from collapsing. But the puppet child stepped forward, its voice reverberating through the cavern. "You cannot close what was never meant to be shut. This place was built for us, your house was built on top of us. We were buried here long before you, long before your kind. And you, it pointed one small finger at Daniel. You are just the next to feed. Claire shook her head violently, tears flying. No. No, she's still in there, I know my baby's still in there. Lily, please. She took a step forward, ignoring Daniel's frantic grip on her arm. Fight them. You're stronger than they are, sweetheart. It's Mommy, I'm here. For a flicker of a moment, the thing paused. The grin faltered. Its lips trembled, and the chorus of voices fractured, one faint childlike voice straining to rise above the din. Mommy, it whispered, so soft Claire almost missed it. Her knees nearly buckled, but hope surged through her like fire. Yes. Yes, it's me, baby, she cried. Hold on, we'll get you out. Just hold on. But the chorus returned with a vengeance, drowning out the fragile spark of Lily's voice. The thing's face twisted, its smile stretching too wide, splitting the corners of its mouth until thin cracks of darkness bled across its cheeks. She is ours, it hissed. She belongs beneath. The colossal bone figure bellowed, the sound like 1,000 wailing souls released at once, and raised its massive arm again. This time, Daniel knew the blow was coming. He shoved Claire to the side, bracing himself for the impact. The monster's arm crashed down, striking the ground where they had stood. Dirt and bone shards exploded outward in a violent shockwave, knocking them both sprawling. Daniel's flashlight clattered from his hand and rolled across the cavern floor, its beam spinning wildly until it landed on something in the wall. His breath caught. There, half buried in the dirt and sigils, was a door. Not a tunnel, not an illusion, but a real, wooden door, old and rotting, its iron hinges rusted but intact. It looked impossibly out of place, as if someone had built it into the very fabric of the earth. Claire scrambled toward him, clutching his arm. Danny, do you see it? He nodded, his chest heaving. The door pulsed faintly, almost in time with the glowing sigils. He didn't know what lay behind it, but every nerve in his body told him it was their only chance. The creature noticed their gaze. Its black eyes narrowed, and the chorus of voices shifted into a furious roar. You cannot go there. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He grabbed Claire's hand and pulled her toward the door, their feet slipping on the damp earth as the bone colossus bellowed and swung its arm again. The ground shook violently, bones rattling like wind chimes in a storm, but Daniel forced himself forward, his entire body screaming with adrenaline. They reached the door. Daniel seized the iron handle, its surface icy cold against his palm, and wrenched it open. A rush of stale, frigid air blasted out, carrying with it the faintest echo of whispers, different from the others. Not mocking, not hungry. Pleading. Claire's eyes widened as she stared into the abyss beyond. Danny, what is this? He swallowed hard, his heart pounding. I don't know, he said, his voice a ragged whisper. But it's better than staying here. And together, they stepped through. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening boom, sealing them into darkness. The darkness beyond the door was so complete it seemed to swallow them whole. For a moment, Daniel thought he'd gone blind, his eyes strained desperately, but there was nothing, no shapes, no light, only the suffocating press of pitch black. The stale air was colder here, damp and metallic, as though they had stepped into the lungs of something vast and ancient. The whispers followed them through, but they had changed. Gone were the mocking voices, the chorus of hunger that had taunted them in the cavern. These whispers were fractured, broken, almost human. They rose and fell in weak gasps, carrying notes of desperation, like the dying words of men and women who had begged but never been heard. Claire clung to his arm, her fingernails digging deep into his skin. Danny, her voice cracked, trembling with the weight of fear. I can't see her. I can't see Lily. Where is she? Where did they take her? Her words dissolved into sobs, and Daniel pulled her close, though his own heart felt like it might burst from his chest. The door behind them vanished with a heavy thud. When Daniel twisted around, there was no handle, no seam, only rough stones stretching endlessly behind. He lifted the flashlight, praying it would still work after the cavern's chaos, and with a trembling thumb, clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, revealing a narrow corridor carved from stone, its walls lined with the same curling sigils that had pulsed in the cavern. But here, they weren't glowing. They looked faded, worn down by time, their edges softened like old carvings left to rot. The floor sloped downward at a subtle angle, and the air carried with it a faint draft that smelled faintly of seawater, brine, and something fouler, like wet decay. Claire brushed at her cheeks with shaking hands. "This is wrong," she whispered, her voice shaking. "This isn't an escape." We went deeper. We went further in. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself forward. "We don't have a choice. We keep moving." The corridor stretched on endlessly, each step echoing far louder than it should have. Sometimes Daniel thought he heard footsteps behind them, perfectly in sync with theirs but one beat late, as though someone, or something, was following just outside the range of the light. Every so often, the whispers would rise, rushing against his ears like a tide, and he swore he could make out fragments of words. "Help me. They buried us. Don't look at it. Don't let it see you." Claire heard them too. She clapped her hands over her ears and stumbled, her voice breaking. "Make it stop, Danny, please, make them stop." "I can't," he hissed, gripping her hand tighter. We just keep moving, okay? We'll find Lily. We'll find a way out." But even as he said it, the doubt gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the thought that the voices weren't random, they were guiding them. Or warning them. Or maybe both. The corridor widened suddenly, spilling into another chamber, smaller than the cavern above but no less horrifying. The flashlight beam swept across the walls, and Claire gasped. They weren't bare stone, they were lined with alcoves. Each alcove held a body, pressed upright into the walls, sealed halfway into the rock. Men, women, and children, their faces twisted in agony, mouths frozen open mid-scream. Their skin was dry, stretched tight over bone, their eyes sunk in hollows staring blankly into the dark. Some were dressed in tatters of clothing from centuries past, others still wore garments that looked eerily modern, their colors faded but familiar. Claire's knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, her cries echoing around the chamber. "Dear God! Danny, they're alive. They're still alive." Daniel's stomach turned violently as he stepped closer, shining the light across one of the figures. Its chest rose and fell, barely, shallow and slow, as though each breath cost unimaginable effort. The lips trembled, cracked and dry, and then parted. A whisper seeped out, so faint Daniel had to lean in to hear. "Kill me." The words were a rasp, but they struck like a hammer to the skull. Daniel stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. All around them, the other figures stirred faintly, their lips quivering, their voices overlapping in a discordant chorus of pleas. "Let us go. It hurts. Bury it deeper. She is not your child." Claire covered her face with her hands, sobbing hysterically. "No, no, stop, I can't, please." Her cries were drowned out by the rising cacophony of the trapped souls, their whispers swelling into a grotesque harmony that filled the chamber. Daniel yanked her up, his voice breaking with panic. "We have to keep moving. We can't stop here." But as he pulled her toward another passage at the far end of the chamber, something shifted in the stone wall. The bodies quivered violently, their mouths stretching wider, too wide, their jaws cracking with grotesque pops. Their voices rose in unison, screaming not whispers but a single word. "Below!" The floor lurched beneath their feet, tilting so suddenly that Daniel and Claire crashed to their knees. The ground split open, a jagged crack racing across the chamber. A foul wind rushed upward, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of decay and salt. Daniel barely had time to register what was happening before the crack widened, and the floor gave way entirely. Claire screamed, clinging to him, and together they plunged downward into the abyss below, swallowed by the black. The fall seemed endless. Daniel's stomach wrenched as he and Claire tumbled through the choking black, their screams swallowed by the roar of rushing air. He clung to her with everything he had, his arms wrapped so tightly around her waist that his muscles burned, terrified that if he let go even for a moment, she would vanish into the void. The flashlight spun from his hand, its beam careening wildly before it disappeared into the dark below. The plunge ended not with a bone-shattering crash but with a jarring, wet impact, as though they had landed in a pit of thick mud. Daniel's vision swam as he clawed his way upright, gasping for air, only to realize he was standing knee-deep in water. The chamber around them hummed with a low, vibrating pulse, a sound that seemed to seep directly into his bones. Claire surfaced beside him, coughing violently, her hair plastered across her pale face. The water was freezing, thick with the sharp taste of salt and iron. He helped her up, but the floor beneath them wasn't solid rock, it was soft, slick, almost fleshy. When he shifted his weight, the ground gave a little, as if he were standing on something alive. He gagged, forcing his mind not to linger on the thought. The faint light from the flashlight, somehow still glowing faintly a few feet away, illuminated only the nearest edges of the chamber. Beyond that, it was endless darkness, the ceiling impossibly high and the walls hidden from sight. Then, from somewhere unseen, the whispers began again, but they were no longer disembodied or distant. They were all around, rising from the water, from the walls, from below his very feet. Each voice was clearer now, distinct, as if the owners were standing inches from his ear. Daniel. Claire. Why did you come here? You brought her back. The sound of their names made Daniel's chest tighten painfully. He turned, searching the dark, but there was no one. Claire clutched his arm, trembling violently, her teeth chattering not from the cold but from terror. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "They know us. They know who we are." And then he saw it, the walls of the chamber weren't stone at all. The dim beam of the flashlight had caught on a surface that rippled, a vast curve rising from the water like the inside of a dome. But it wasn't rock. It was skin. Pale, translucent, veins branching across it like rivers, pulsing faintly with a sickly glow. Daniel froze, his breath seizing in his lungs. The realization came too quickly, too violently for him to deny. They weren't in a cavern. They were inside something alive. A deep vibration rolled through the chamber, rattling the water's surface. Claire gasped and clutched his sleeve. "It's awake," she whimpered. "Oh God, Danny, it's waking up." From the darkness above, shapes began to lower, tendrils, slick and glistening, dripping with the same briny water that surrounded them. They swayed lazily at first, like seaweed caught in a current, but as the whispers grew louder, they stretched downward with purpose, questing through the dark. One brushed against Daniel's shoulder, and the contact burned like acid. He screamed, shoving it away, the skin beneath his shirt blistering instantly. The tendril recoiled, and the chamber shuddered in response, the whispers splitting into shrieks of anger. Claire's voice cracked with panic. "It's feeding on them. The voices, it's the people, Danny, all those people in the walls, they're not dead. They're inside it." Her words sent a chill through him that was colder than the water around them. He remembered the bodies sealed in the alcoves, the whispered pleas for release, the way the ground seemed alive beneath their feet. This thing, the thing that lived beneath their farmhouse, it wasn't just ancient. It wasn't just monstrous. It was a prison, a tomb, and a stomach all at once. The water rippled violently, and with it came something worse, a faint splash, small and delicate, like someone paddling through the dark. Daniel spun toward the sound, his breath catching in his throat, and his blood turned to ice. There, just beyond the faint glow of the flashlight, was Lily. Their daughter. She stood in the waist-high water, her pajamas soaked, her long hair hanging limp, her wide eyes fixed on them. "Mommy? Daddy?" Her voice was small, trembling, but eerily steady for the place they were in. "It says I can stay. It says you don't have to be scared anymore." Claire screamed her name and surged forward, but Daniel grabbed her, holding her back with all the strength he had left. His heart broke at the sound of Lily's voice, but something about her tone, about the way she stood so unnaturally still in the freezing water, screamed wrong. Her face shifted slightly in the dark, her lips twitching into a smile that didn't belong on their little girl. The whispers surged louder, twisting into laughter, into mockery, into one word repeated again and again. "Stay. The tendrils shot downward, lashing toward them with horrifying speed. Daniel shoved Claire behind him and grabbed the flashlight, its beam flaring across Lily's face for a fraction of a second. What he saw was not his daughter's innocent gaze, it was hollow, black eyes stretching too wide, her mouth splitting impossibly as the voices poured from her in a deafening chorus. And then the tendrils struck. The tendrils whipped through the air with a crack like breaking bones, slamming into the water around them. Waves splashed up against Daniel's face as he dragged Claire back, his lungs burning with terror. The air itself felt suffocating, heavy with rot, and every breath carried the taste of brine and copper. He raised the flashlight higher, its trembling beam cutting through the wet blackness, and caught another glimpse of Lily. She hadn't moved, not really, not the way a child would. She was perfectly still, her chest rising and falling too slowly, her head tilting at an unnatural angle as the tendrils arched around her protectively, almost reverently, like she was their chosen vessel. Claire fought against Daniel's grip, her nails digging into his arm. "Let me go! That's our daughter. She's right there." Her voice was raw with desperation, cracking in a way that made Daniel's heart ache. He wanted nothing more than to let her run, to scoop Lily into his arms, to believe for one impossible moment that everything would be okay. But he knew, deep in his bones, that what they were seeing was not Lily. Or, at least, not anymore. The whispers grew into a storm, every syllable colliding until it became a roar of many voices speaking as one. "She is ours. She is bound. She is the bridge." The words rattled Daniel's skull, vibrating in his teeth, forcing bile into his throat. The water beneath them surged, and for a sickening moment, he swore he saw faces rising in the ripples, half-formed, human, mouths open in silent screams, their eyes hollow and pleading. They vanished with the next pulse of light, but the image burned into his mind. Claire's sobs broke through the noise. She tore herself free and waded toward Lily, the water splashing violently as she fought her way forward. "Lily, baby, come to mommy, please, just come here," her voice fractured with hope and fear, echoing into the endless chamber. Daniel reached after her, screaming her name, but before he could catch her, the tendrils lashed forward, wrapping around her waist, her arms, her neck. She screamed, thrashing wildly, as the things pulled her toward the wall of living flesh. Daniel surged forward, adrenaline drowning out every instinct for self-preservation. He threw himself into the water, slamming his body into Claire's to keep her from being dragged further. His fingers clawed at the slick tendrils, tearing his skin as he tried to rip them free. The things pulsed under his grip, as though veins ran through them, carrying something hot and alive. Every time he tore one away, two more wrapped around them. The whispers rose to a crescendo, their voices shrieking in his ears until blood trickled from his nose. And then Lily spoke again. "Daddy." The sound froze him. Her tone was softer now, smaller, more like his little girl than the hollow-eyed thing that had been standing in the dark. He turned his head, just enough to see her tiny arms outstretched toward him, her lips trembling as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Help me, Daddy. It hurts." Daniel's heart split in two. Every rational part of him screamed it was a trick, that the thing had pulled her voice from his memories, crafted it into bait. But the father in him, the man who had tucked her in every night, who had kissed her forehead and promised to keep her safe, couldn't ignore the pleading in her eyes. His grip faltered, and in that instant, the tendrils tightened, yanking Claire down beneath the water. She disappeared with a muffled scream. Bubbles exploded to the surface where she'd been, but then, silence. The water smoothed out, black and still, swallowing her whole. "No!" Daniel's cry tore from his throat as he plunged his arms into the water, searching, thrashing, desperate to pull her back. His hands grasped at nothing, only the icy depths sucking at his skin. He screamed her name again and again, until his voice broke, but the only answer was the chorus of whispers rising around him. Slowly, the voices began to change. They softened, harmonizing, weaving together into something almost melodic. A chant. A lullaby. And threaded through it all was Lily's voice, clear and sweet, singing a tune he remembered from nights long ago when Claire had rocked her to sleep. The sound cut deeper than any scream. Daniel staggered back, water sloshing around his legs, tears streaming down his face. He raised the flashlight again with trembling hands, sweeping it desperately across the chamber. That's when he saw it, not Lily, not Claire, but a shape rising from the far wall. It was enormous, humanoid in outline but grotesque in detail. A ribcage too wide, arms too long, a face that stretched like melting wax, its mouth opening wider than a human's ever could. Its chest pulsed with a faint glow, and inside that glow, Daniel swore he saw hundreds of writhing figures, trapped, clawing at the translucent flesh from within. The realization struck like lightning. The whispers weren't coming from around him. They were coming from inside this thing. From the souls, the people, the children who had been swallowed whole. The farmhouse wasn't cursed. It wasn't haunted. It was just the mask, the feeding ground, for the thing that lived beneath it. And it had his family now. As the monstrous form began to pull itself higher from the water, its immense shadow blotting out the last of the light, Daniel understood one final, horrifying truth. The voices had never begged for release. They had begged for company. And now, the thing had decided it wanted him too. Daniel's body shook as the enormity of it pressed down on him. The creature's vast outline filled the chamber like a cathedral built of flesh and sorrow, its every movement accompanied by the groaning sound of stretching muscle and cracking bone. The voices swelled, no longer indistinct whispers but a torrent of languages, tones, and cries, all layered on top of each other until it became a hymn of despair. He staggered backward, but there was no place to run. The water stretched into infinity, the walls curving in like the inside of some impossible womb. He realized, with an icy dread that sank deep into his marrow, that he was not in a cavern at all, he was inside the thing itself. The flashlight flickered weakly in his trembling grip, casting shadows across the monstrous rib-like structures rising from the water. Each one seemed to pulse faintly with an inner glow, and Daniel realized with horror what that light was. Trapped inside those translucent cages, pressed against the walls, were shapes, humanoid but twisted, faces flattened against the flesh as though they were struggling to push through. He could make out eyes staring back at him, mouths moving in silent screams that became the whispers in his ears. For a terrible moment, he thought he saw Claire among them, her face contorted in agony, her hands clawing against the barrier as if reaching for him. His knees buckled, and he dropped the flashlight, its beam swinging wildly before settling half submerged in the water. His reflection stared back at him from the rippling surface, but it wasn't alone. The water shimmered unnaturally, and in it he saw Lily again, not the hollow-eyed apparition from before, but his daughter as she truly was. Her round face, her tear-streaked cheeks, her small hands pressed against the invisible surface between them. "Daddy," she whispered in the reflection, though her lips didn't move. "It hurts. Please, make it stop." Daniel's throat tightened until he could barely breathe. He reached toward the water as if he could scoop her out, but the surface remained solid beneath his fingertips, like glass. Behind her reflection, the monster loomed larger, its eyes opening now, if they could be called eyes at all. They were immense black voids, deep and endless, and staring into them made Daniel feel as though his mind were unraveling. The voices fell suddenly silent, cut off as if by command. The chamber held its breath, and then, like a tide crashing against rock, one voice rose above the rest. It was deeper, more resonant, vibrating the air around him. It was not a whisper but a presence, as if the creature itself had chosen to speak. "Choose." The word echoed through Daniel's skull, his vision flaring with pain. He clutched his head, shaking, gasping for air. The meaning was clear, though no further explanation came. The thing wanted a decision. It offered him an ultimatum. He could surrender, become part of the endless choir within its body, where Claire and Lily already seemed to be, or he could resist. But even as the thought formed, he knew resistance was a lie. No one who had entered here had ever escaped. The bones in the farmhouse walls, the faces pressed against the chamber's flesh, the generations of victims, it was all proof of what defiance bought, eternity inside the beast. "Please, Daddy," Lily's voice came again, this time not from the water, but from everywhere at once. It was woven into the chant, threaded through the voices of the damned, a cry that clawed at his sanity. "Don't leave me here alone." His mind broke into fragments, torn between the unbearable weight of loss and the instinct to survive. Could he abandon them? Could he live with himself if he clawed his way out, leaving Claire and Lily behind to rot inside this thing forever? Or was it better to surrender, to step willingly into its embrace and be devoured, if it meant being with them, even in this twisted form of existence? The water around him rippled violently as the tendrils stirred, circling closer, their tips brushing against his arms, his chest, his throat. They weren't attacking now. They were inviting, coaxing him to submit. He felt the burn of their touch, but beneath the pain was something else, an almost euphoric warmth, a seduction that pulled at his very soul. A vision flashed in his mind, unbidden, a world where he and Claire and Lily lived in peace, walking through fields bathed in sunlight, their laughter echoing. He knew it was a lie, a construct dangled before him, but the ache in his heart made it almost irresistible. "No," he croaked, shaking his head violently. His voice was ragged, raw. "You don't get to take us. You don't get to rewrite who we are." The chamber trembled violently, the monster's void eyes narrowing. The water surged higher, slamming against his chest, and the tendrils snapped tighter, wrapping around his torso like ropes. He screamed as they lifted him off his feet, dragging him toward the wall of flesh where the trapped faces writhed. Their mouths opened wider, and he realized with bone-deep terror that they weren't begging for help anymore, they were welcoming him. "Join us," they whispered in unison. Daniel thrashed with every ounce of strength left in him. His hand closed around the flashlight still bobbing in the water, and he swung it wildly, the beam strobing across the chamber. For a split second, the light cut across the monster's face, and in that moment he saw something, a scar, a fissure running across its flesh, glowing faintly like a wound that never healed. It was small, almost insignificant, but in his desperate mind it was enough. A weakness. A target. With a guttural scream, Daniel drove the flashlight forward, jamming it into the glowing fissure as hard as he could. The glass shattered instantly, sparks spitting into the wound, and the chamber erupted with a sound that shook the marrow of his bones. The monster convulsed, the water thrashing violently as the tendrils spasmed and released him. Daniel dropped back into the water, lungs burning, ears ringing, his heart pounding with the insane possibility that he had just heard it. The voices shrieked, not in unison, not in command, but in chaos. For the first time, they sounded afraid. And in that deafening storm, Daniel realized something: if it could bleed, it could be killed. The chamber convulsed as if it had taken a mortal wound. The walls quivered, the translucent flesh rippling like water disturbed by a stone. Daniel staggered to his feet, his chest heaving, his ribs aching with every breath. He clung to the jagged remnant of the shattered flashlight, its edges slick with his own blood where glass had cut into his palm. The wound he had made in the beast's flesh oozed a black, tar-like fluid that hissed and smoked as it dripped into the water below. The voices inside the chamber screamed, not in harmony but in discordant agony, their pleas cracking into shrill howls that rattled his skull. He turned, desperate to find another weapon, another tool, anything. But there was nothing in this place but water, flesh, and bone. The faint glow from the fissure was already dimming, the monster's wound beginning to close. It was healing. His one desperate strike had only bought him a heartbeat of reprieve. The tendrils surged back to life, snapping through the water like serpents, their ends bristling with barbs that glistened in the faint light. One lashed across his shoulder, slicing through his flesh as if it were paper. He screamed, clutching the wound, hot blood spilling down his arm. The thing wasn't just trying to bind him anymore. It was punishing him. Then he heard it, her voice. Claire. It was faint at first, buried beneath the cacophony, but it grew louder, clearer, threading through the screams. "Daniel," she cried. "Don't stop. You heard it, you can kill it. Do it for Lily." He spun toward the sound, his heart seizing in his chest. On the far wall of flesh, a face pressed outward, a face he knew better than his own. Claire's eyes, her mouth, her hands clawing desperately as though she were straining against a translucent coffin. Her gaze locked onto his, filled with a strength he didn't know she still had. "Daniel," she gasped, her voice muffled but undeniable, "don't let it keep us here. End it." Tears blurred his vision. He wanted to rip her free, to tear the wall open with his bare hands, but the flesh pulsed and writhed, resisting him. The monster shuddered, and with it came Lily's voice, small and broken. "Daddy. I'm scared." Her face appeared beside Claire's, half submerged in the pulsing wall, her little hands stretching outward. Daniel fell to his knees, sobbing, his resolve cracking. To destroy the thing might mean destroying them too. The chamber thundered again, the voice of the creature booming inside his head, "Choose. Choose." He slammed his fists against the fleshy wall, his rage spilling out of him in a raw, guttural scream. "I will not choose between my family and my soul." His voice echoed, swallowed by the chamber, but it felt like the first true defiance he had offered since stepping into this nightmare. The fissure pulsed again, brighter this time, as though the creature itself recoiled at his defiance. He realized then that the wound wasn't just a scar, it was a seam. A fault line. Maybe even the creature's heart. If he could strike it again, harder, deeper, he might be able to rip it open. He scanned the water frantically, searching for anything sharp, anything with weight. His hand brushed against something solid beneath the surface, half buried in muck. He pulled, grunting, and wrenched it free, a rusted metal pipe, jagged at one end. Heavy. Dangerous. The voices howled, sensing what he intended. Tendrils lashed at him with renewed fury, wrapping around his legs, his arms, pulling him down into the water. He thrashed violently, kicking and clawing, but they were too strong. His head slipped beneath the surface, the icy black closing over him, filling his nose and mouth with salt and blood. In the suffocating silence, faces swirled around him, Claire, Lily, countless strangers, mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes pleaded with him, begged him to let go, to surrender. His lungs burned, and darkness crept in at the edges of his vision. But then, he felt it. A hand. Warm. Small. Soft. It pressed against his, cutting through the cold. Lily. Not the twisted reflection, not the false mimicry, the real Lily. Or maybe just the memory of her. Her voice echoed in his mind, not from the chamber, not from the monster, but from his own heart. "You promised you'd always keep me safe, Daddy." His body surged with new strength. With a roar that bubbled up through the water, he broke the surface, dragging the pipe upward. The tendrils whipped around him, but he spun, slashing, hacking, the jagged end tearing into their flesh. Black ichor sprayed across his face, burning his skin, but he didn't stop. Step by step, he forced his way back toward the glowing fissure, every inch of progress won with blood and agony. When he reached it, he raised the pipe high, both hands gripping it tight. "This ends now," he bellowed, his voice cracking into madness. And with every ounce of strength left in his broken body, he drove the pipe into the fissure. The chamber erupted. The walls convulsed violently, the flesh splitting open, light pouring from the wound so bright it seared his eyes. The voices screamed in a single, unified shriek of agony that shook the chamber apart. The water surged upward like a tidal wave, lifting Daniel off his feet and hurling him backward. He slammed against something hard, his vision fracturing into bursts of white. The last thing he saw before the light consumed him was Claire and Lily's faces pressed against the wall, smiling. Free. And then, silence. Daniel lay sprawled in darkness, the cold stone beneath him biting into his skin. For a long time, he didn't move, his body trembling, his lungs heaving ragged breaths that tore at his throat. The last memory of that blinding eruption still lingered in his mind like an afterimage burned into his eyes. Slowly, painfully, he pried his eyelids open, only to find himself staring into a gloom so thick it felt almost solid. Yet something was different. The oppressive humidity, the pulsing, living flesh, the constant chorus of whispers, gone. The silence was profound, almost holy, and it pressed against his ears with a weight heavier than the voices ever had. He struggled to his feet, swaying like a drunk, gripping the wall for balance. But the wall was not flesh, it was rough stone, damp and cold, carved into blocks. A tunnel. His heart hammered in his chest. Had he been thrown into another part of the farmhouse's hidden foundation? Or had he somehow been expelled from the creature itself? He staggered forward, each step a war against exhaustion, dragging his wounded arm against his body to keep it from dangling uselessly. His shoulders screamed with pain, his vision swam, but he pressed on, each shuffle driven by one thought: Claire. Lily. Please. The tunnel narrowed until he could barely fit through, scraping his shoulders along jagged edges. Ahead, a faint glow pulsed. Not the sickly phosphorescence of the beast's body, but a pale, steady light, natural, real. He lunged toward it, his feet stumbling, his breath tearing out of him. And then he emerged into a cavern unlike anything he had ever seen. The walls were carved with symbols, ancient and precise, spirals and lines etched deep into the stone, glowing faintly as though lit from within. In the center of the cavern stood an altar, black and monolithic, its surface slick with something that shimmered faintly in the light. Around it lay bones. Hundreds of them. Some small, fragile, unmistakably belonging to children. Others massive, human skulls grinning with hollow sockets, jaws forever frozen in silent screams. Daniel gagged, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't just a chamber. It was a tomb. A feeding ground. His knees buckled, and he collapsed against the wall, clutching at his head. The truth hit him with merciless clarity. The farmhouse wasn't just built on cursed land. It was the curse. Generations of families had lived here, each slowly sacrificed, their whispers feeding the thing below, their bodies discarded in this pit like scraps. In the lighthouse he had once read about in those journals, it had been no beacon for ships. It had been a watchtower, a prison, meant to keep whatever this was from spreading. Somehow, someone had failed. The cavern stirred. A low groan vibrated through the stone, and Daniel's head snapped up. The altar trembled, splitting down the middle, revealing a crack of darkness so deep it seemed bottomless. From within, the whispers began again, faint at first, but quickly rising, pressing into his skull like claws. He stumbled backward, his heart thundering. He had destroyed the chamber, but he hadn't destroyed it. The thing beneath was older, deeper, and far from finished with him. And then he heard them again, Claire and Lily. Their voices, faint but clear, rising above the din. Daniel, come home. He froze. His chest ached with longing. He wanted to believe it. God, he wanted to believe it. But doubt gnawed at him. Was it really them? Or just another mask, another trick meant to lure him closer, to finish what had begun? His breath caught, his throat tight. He stepped closer to the altar, peering into the crack. For a moment, he swore he saw them, Claire's warm smile, Lily's bright eyes, both reaching out to him with open arms. But behind their faces, something else moved. A shadow. Vast, endless, shifting. The faint outline of teeth, not in a mouth but in a void, a grin that stretched wider than anything human. And in that grin, Daniel realized the truth, the voices weren't calling for rescue. They were calling him down. His hands trembled as he gripped the rusted pipe still clutched in his palm. His body was broken, his mind fractured, but somewhere deep inside, a spark remained. He couldn't let it win. He couldn't let it take him, too. The altar pulsed, the fissure widening, and the cavern shook with violent tremors. He had a choice: step forward and embrace the voices, or end it here, once and for all, even if it meant joining the dead. He raised the pipe, blood dripping from his fingers, every muscle in his body quivering with fear and rage. His voice cracked as he screamed into the cavern, "You will not have me. You will not have them." And with that, he brought the pipe down toward the altar. The moment the rusted pipe slammed against the altar, the cavern erupted with a deafening roar that seemed to come from inside the stone itself. Sparks flew as metal struck black rock, and a crack splintered across the altar's surface, glowing with a blinding white light. Daniel staggered backward, shielding his eyes as the fissure widened. The air rushed out of the chamber in a violent gale, sucking the breath from his lungs and dragging at his body as if unseen hands were trying to pull him down into the opening. He dug his boots into the stone floor, every muscle screaming as he fought to resist the pull, the pipe clattering uselessly from his grip as his strength began to fail. The voices screamed in unison now, no longer whispers but a chorus of anguish and rage, filling the cavern with a cacophony that rattled his bones. Daniel pressed his hands over his ears, but the sound wasn't just external, it clawed inside his skull, digging through his memories, dredging up every moment of guilt and fear he had ever buried. He saw Claire's face again, but now it was twisted, her smile too wide, her eyes empty hollows. Lily's laughter warped into shrieks that rose higher and higher until they broke into static. He cried out, falling to his knees, feeling blood trickle from his ears as if his very body was rejecting the sound. But amidst the horror, something else stirred. A warmth. A voice, not from the pit, but from within him. Claire's real voice, soft, steady, the way she used to calm him when his nightmares woke him in the dead of night. Don't listen to them. You already know the truth. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus, to separate her words from the storm of lies around him. He thought of Lily's tiny hand wrapped around his finger the day she was born, the weight of her in his arms, fragile but alive, real. These weren't illusions. These were memories that belonged to him, not to the thing beneath the floor. He forced himself to stand, his legs trembling but steadying with each breath. The altar cracked further, the black stone splintering apart as something vast began to push through from the other side. Daniel glimpsed it only for an instant, a form too massive to comprehend, its edges shifting like smoke but darker than shadow, tendrils coiling outward, dripping with the same sickly light he had seen in the farmhouse walls. Its presence alone filled the cavern with suffocating dread, as though reality itself was bending under the strain of holding it back. Daniel realized then that this wasn't a place of worship. It was a lock. A prison. The altar had never been an altar at all, it was the last barrier keeping the creature sealed beneath the earth. And by striking it, he hadn't destroyed it. He had weakened it. Panic clawed through him, but alongside it came a grim clarity. He couldn't kill it. It was too old, too vast, beyond the reach of any weapon. But he could still seal it. He could still stop it from spreading beyond this cursed house, this cursed land. The thought chilled him to his core, because he already knew what that would mean. The cavern quaked violently, chunks of stone tumbling from the ceiling, the glow of the runes flaring brighter and brighter as if resisting the creature's push. Daniel staggered to the altar, forcing himself forward despite the gale force pull from the abyss. He reached out, his hand pressing against the cracked stone. It was scorching hot, searing his flesh instantly, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he closed his eyes, whispering through clenched teeth, "If you want a voice, take mine." For a heartbeat, everything froze. The whispers stopped. The pull lessened. And then the altar flared, flooding the cavern with blinding light. Daniel screamed, the sound ripped from his chest, not in pain but in surrender, as he felt the entity latch onto him, dragging at his very soul. The light spread outward, racing through the runes on the walls, sealing each line, each spiral, as though rewriting the prison in fire. His body convulsed, his vision went white, and the last thing he felt was his voice being torn from him, stolen, swallowed, becoming part of the lock itself. The cavern fell silent. The fissure slammed shut with a thunderous crack, the altar knitting itself back together, whole and unbroken. The whispers faded into nothing. The air stilled. And where Daniel had stood, there was nothing but ash and the faint echo of his final scream, lingering only long enough to be swallowed by silence. Far above, in the farmhouse, the floorboards ceased their groaning. The air lightened. For the first time in decades, the house stood quiet, as if exhaling a long-held breath. But in the stillness, if one pressed an ear to the cold stone below, they might hear a faint whisper, not of hunger, not of rage, but of warning. A man's voice, forever bound beneath the house, repeating the same plea over and over. Don't dig. Don't listen. Don't let it out. For years, the farmhouse stood in silence, its windows dark and hollow, the paint peeling away with each passing season. Locals in the nearest town spoke of it only in whispers, passing the property on country roads with averted eyes. Some said the family who had lived there had simply disappeared, their belongings still inside, a dinner half-eaten on the table. Others claimed the place had finally gone quiet, and that was reason enough never to disturb it. Superstitions grew thick around the house like ivy, and for a long while no one dared to step foot inside. But time has a way of dulling even the sharpest fears. Developers came and went, drawn by the prospect of cheap land. Surveyors brought their clipboards and tape measures, shaking their heads at the decay but muttering about potential value. One autumn, a couple from the city finally bought the house, eager for peace and quiet, convinced the old stories were nothing more than backwoods folklore. They arrived with boxes, laughter, and plans for renovation. By the second night, their laughter had faded. By the third, the neighbors reported seeing lights flickering in every window, though the couple insisted they had gone to bed early. Inside, the house had changed. The boards no longer groaned with every step. The air no longer carried the stench of mold and something older, deeper. Instead, there was a silence so profound it felt unnatural, as if the walls themselves were listening. And beneath that silence, if one dared to stand very still, alone at night, when the world outside was hushed, there was a faint sound. Not pipes. Not settling wood. A whisper, so soft it could be mistaken for one's own breath. At first it was unintelligible, like a memory half forgotten. But each night, it grew a little clearer. The couple's dog, a shaggy mutt with a bark that usually rattled the windows, refused to step into the cellar. He would sit at the top of the stairs, hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. No treats, no coaxing, no shouting could make him descend. The husband laughed it off, calling the animal sensitive, but his laughter never reached his eyes. He began waking at odd hours, drenched in sweat, insisting he'd heard someone calling his name. The wife brushed it off, too, until one night she heard it herself. A man's voice, faint but unmistakable, seeping through the floorboards. "Don't dig. Don't listen. Don't let it out." She sat up in bed, her pulse hammering, and shook her husband awake. But when she repeated what she'd heard, he stared at her blankly. He had heard the same words, but not as a warning. For him, the voice had sounded different, pleading, desperate. "Help me," it had said. "I'm trapped." The house began to wedge itself between them. The wife grew quiet, withdrawn, listening to the floor at night as though to catch more words. The husband, meanwhile, became restless, spending hours in the cellar, muttering to himself. The dog disappeared one evening, slipping out into the woods, never to return. Their friends stopped visiting after uneasy dinners where the couple barely spoke, their eyes darting constantly toward the floor. By winter, the house looked lived in but hollow, the curtains always drawn, the couple's car sitting in the driveway gathering dust. One night, a storm swept over the countryside, rattling the farmhouse to its bones. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the empty fields, the rain hammering the roof like fists. A neighbor, watching from a distant porch, swore later that he saw the ground around the farmhouse glow, as though light were leaking up from under the earth. The storm passed, but the couple was never seen again. When the sheriff finally entered the house days later, he found their belongings scattered as though abandoned mid-use. The cellar door stood wide open, leading down into darkness. At the bottom, there was nothing, no bodies, no blood, not even footprints. Only a faint hum in the air, like the echo of voices too quiet to make out. The farmhouse stands empty again now, weathering another cycle of seasons. The stories have started to spread once more, whispered warnings passed in bars and gas stations late at night. The refrain is always the same: the house doesn't stay quiet for long. And if you were to press your ear against the cold, cracked boards of the cellar floor, you'd hear it too, just the faintest murmur, threading through the silence. A man's voice, hoarse, weary, but still repeating, caught forever between warning and plea. "Don't dig. Don't listen. Don't let it out."